Hello friends, welcome to our story. Before we start, please like this video and subscribe. Also tell us in the comments where are you watching from. New York, London, maybe South Africa or Jamaica. We want to know. Edward Harlow was 52 years old, and every one of those years was written somewhere on his body like scars that no one else could see. On his face, there was only the serene hardness of a man who had won so many battles he no longer needed to raise his voice to intimidate anyone. In his posture, there was the absolute uprightness of someone who had never bent for anybody, not in the days when he should have, and certainly not in the days when he didn't need to. On that cold Tuesday morning, when the Chicago wind cut the cheeks of passers-by like shards of glass, Edward stepped out of his car, a black Mercedes-Benz S-Class, beige leather inside, carrying the faint scent of new leather and cedar that he had specifically ordered installed, because it reminded him of something he could never quite name, and stopped for exactly 3 seconds on the sidewalk in front of the Harlow Grand. The hotel occupied the top 22 floors of a dark blue glass tower in the heart of Chicago's financial district. The name Harlow was engraved in brushed bronze letters on the facade, each letter 2 feet tall, visible from 3 blocks away in any direction. It was the 17th property of the Harlow Group, a hotel conglomerate spanning 482,000 square meters of built area across 12 cities, with annual revenue of just under $2 billion. 10,000 people worked for Edward Harlow in some capacity, in some time zone. 10,000 people who knew his name without him knowing theirs. Edward walked through the white marble lobby with gray veins, past the central chandelier. 18,000 Swarovski crystals arranged in a cascade, costing $380,000, personally approved by him 2 years prior, which scattered golden light across the polished floor. The 2 security guards at the entrance recognized the posture before they recognized the face and straightened slightly. The receptionist on duty, a young woman named Dana, who had worked at the hotel for 3 years, opened a trained professional smile that Edward did not return, not out of hostility, simply because he had not registered that a smile was waiting for him. Edward Harlow lived inside a bubble he had built with his own hands over decades, and the bubble was too efficient to let small things through, things like a good morning smile. But there was one very specific thing that bubble could no longer block. Something Edward felt every morning when he woke up, between the 200 thread-count Egyptian cotton sheets, in the absolute silence of his penthouse apartment. The absence. Not of any one person in particular. Or perhaps yes, though he had never been able to finish that thought without changing the subject. The absence was like an empty house with no furniture. You could walk through it, sit on the floor, hear your own footsteps echo, and know with perfect precision that this was not a home. Everything was there to make it a home. The walls were standing, the roof was overhead, but the walls held no memories that belonged to anyone besides himself, and the roof covered a space that no other human being called home. Christine had left 8 years ago. 8 years. Edward repeated that number to himself sometimes, not with sharp pain, but with the kind of dull strangeness of someone discovering a scar they had forgotten they had. They had married for reasons that made sense on paper and never quite made sense in real life. Christine was elegant, intelligent, the daughter of a Boston family that understood old money and quiet restraint. Edward had thought that was what he needed, compatible company, a functional marriage. She had tried harder than he had. She had tried for 6 years before she stopped trying. On the morning she left, she placed a single sheet of paper on the kitchen counter. "You're very good at building things, Edward. It's a shame none of them are a reason to stay." He had kept the paper in a drawer. He wasn't sure why. He never reread it. His sister Martha had not called in 4 years. The argument had been over something idiotic, a matter of inheritance involving the house where they grew up, which Edward had sold without consulting anyone because the house was in his name, and he had thought consulting was unnecessary. Martha had cried on the phone with an anger he hadn't understood at the time. "It's not about the money, Edward. It's that you act like other people don't exist when you're making a decision." He had replied that he had deposited her share within 24 hours. Martha had hung up. She never called back. Edward had tried once, 3 months later, on an impulse he couldn't quite explain. The call went to voicemail. He didn't leave a message. There was, therefore, at the center of the greatest asset Edward Harlow possessed, which was not the hotel, not the group, not the penthouse apartment. There was a silence that no contract had ever been able to fill. His greatest asset was himself, the capacity he had to build things from nothing with raw intelligence and iron will. And that asset was, on that morning, riding the service elevator to the 18th floor for a meeting about the East Wing renovation, completely impervious to the possibility that on that very day something was about to change everything. At 10:40 in the morning, between the meeting with the architects and the video call with the New York investors, Edward crossed the main lobby toward the private cafe on the second floor. He made this walk every morning. He knew each step of the route, each security camera, each spot where the marble had a slight irregularity he had ordered corrected 3 times without result. It was the kind of detail that irritated Edward with surgical precision, not because it mattered to the guests, but because it mattered to him. That was when he saw the scene at the main entrance. A man was standing at the revolving door on the outside. Standing wasn't exactly the right word. He was leaning, as though his legs were still doing the work but doing it out of obligation, not vigor. The man was over 60, perhaps close to 70. He wore a gray wool coat that had been good in some distant era, and now had worn circles at both elbows. His trousers were an indefinable brownish color, neither brown nor gray, the kind of color that happens when clothing is washed too many times. His shoes, and Edward always looked at shoes. It was an old habit from the days when he had nothing and knew how to tell who had money from who was pretending. His shoes were synthetic leather, with the sole beginning to peel at the left toe, and there was a strip of brown tape attempting to hold the damage together. The man had asked one of the front desk staff for a glass of water. The receptionist, Dana, had called Marcus, the morning security guard, with a discreet look that Edward recognized immediately. The trained look of someone who had learned to handle that kind of situation without making a scene. Marcus had approached the man with the polite firmness that the hotel's conduct manual prescribed for such occasions. He was explaining, in a low voice with a slight forward lean, that the space was restricted to guests and that there was a municipal cafe 2 blocks away. The man did not react with anger. He did not insist. He did not make a scene. He simply looked at Marcus with a tiredness so old it did not seem to belong to that particular morning. It seemed to have been accumulating for years. Then he turned his face toward the lobby, and his eyes found Edward. Edward did not recognize the face. He had never seen this man in his life, he was almost certain. But there was something in the gaze, a kind of quiet recognition, unsurprised, like someone spotting on the horizon something they had been expecting to find for a very long time. That made Edward stop for 1 second more than was normal. Then Edward turned toward the elevator and stepped inside. The man was guided to the sidewalk with professional gentleness. Marcus held the revolving door. The man stepped out without another word and stood on the sidewalk in the cold, hands in the pockets of his worn coat, and looked up at the facade for a moment before beginning to walk slowly north. His name was Thomas Reed, 67 years old, a resident of a rooming house in the Pilsen neighborhood, where he paid $340 a month for a room with a window facing the corridor. Edward Harlow would not know that name on that day, but he would know it in 72 hours. 3 days after the scene in the lobby, Edward was in the conference room on the 18th floor when his assistant, Patricia, entered with the expression of someone carrying something uncomfortable. Patricia had worked with Edward for 11 years. She was a 45-year-old woman of clockwork precision, steel loyalty, and the rare ability to communicate bad news without unnecessary drama. When she walked in wearing that expression, Edward looked up from the screen and waited. "There's an attorney in the lobby," Patricia said. "Diane Foster, Foster and Crane. She says she represents a Mr. Thomas Reed and has a document to deliver personally to you. I tried to convince her to leave it with me, but she was quite firm." Edward knew the name of the firm. It was a small but solid practice, specialized in family law and estate matters. It was not the kind of firm that sent representatives with frivolous demands. "Send her in," Edward said. Diane Foster was 40 years old and wore a navy blue suit with a white high-collar blouse. She had chestnut hair cut to her jaw and thin-framed glasses that rested on her nose with a precision suggesting she had chosen them carefully. She entered with the posture of someone who was not there to impress anyone, but was also not there to be dismissed quickly. She carried a black leather folder under her arm. She did not accept the coffee Patricia offered. She sat in the chair across from Edward and placed the folder on the table without opening it immediately. "Mr. Harlow," she said, "I represent Thomas Reed, 67 years old, a former employee of the Wayne County Civil Registry in Detroit, Michigan. Mr. Reed is ill. His doctors estimate he has between 3 and 5 months to live. Before passing, he expressed the urgent desire to personally deliver to you a document he has kept for 29 years. Edward stayed quiet. "Mr. Reed attempted to contact you by letter on 2 occasions, in 2003 and in 2010, and by email in 2015. None of those attempts reached you directly." Diane opened the folder and removed a sealed white envelope with the name Edward Harlow written by hand in careful, slightly trembling letters. She placed it on the table and pushed it gently toward Edward. "What is this?" Edward asked. His voice was completely neutral. It was the tone he used when he hadn't yet decided how to feel about something. "Mr. Reed asked that you open it in private," Diane said. "But he also asked that I remain in the city until tomorrow, in case you had questions or wished to speak with him." She stood, picked up the empty folder, and left the room with the same calm precision with which she had entered. Edward stared at the envelope for 40 seconds. Then he extended his hand, picked it up, and opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a photocopy of a birth certificate. The original document was from the state of Michigan, dated April of 1993. The child's name was Lucas Reed Harlow, male. Date of birth, April 14, 1993. Mother, Rachel Ann Reed. Father, Edward James Harlow. Edward read the mother's name. He read it again. Rachel Ann Reed. The paper trembled slightly in his hands, not because he was shaking, but because there was a small vibration that had begun somewhere inside his chest and was traveling to his fingertips through pathways he could not control. Rachel. 30 years. It had been 30 years since he had spoken that name out loud. He had loved Rachel Reed in his years of nothing. In his Detroit years, when he worked 12 hours a day on construction sites and studied at night in a technical course he could barely afford, coming home with hands roughened by cement and his pride intact. Rachel was the daughter of a neighbor, lived 3 houses down, was 18 years old, had a laugh that opened like a window on a cloudy day, and had no interest whatsoever in boys who tried to impress her. She had become interested in Edward precisely because he did not try to impress her. He simply showed up, worked, read his books, and listened when she talked. They had been together for 11 months, and then Rachel had disappeared. Simply disappeared. Without a letter, without a message, without explanation. Her family said she had moved to the interior to stay with an aunt. Edward had waited. He had tried calling the aunt's number someone had given him. It never answered. He had waited for weeks, then months. And then he had concluded, with the dry bitterness of someone who learns early not to hold on to what leaves, that Rachel had decided to go without saying goodbye. That she had chosen to disappear. That this was a clear enough answer. Edward had never understood why. Until now. Lucas Reed Harlow, born in April of 1993, 30 years old. There was a 30-year-old son somewhere in the world that Edward did not know existed. Edward set the paper on the table. He stared at the ceiling for a moment. Then he called Patricia. "Cancel everything for the afternoon," he said, "and give me the number for the attorney who came in." Diane Foster answered on the second ring. "I need to speak with Thomas Reed," Edward said, without introduction, without protocol courtesy. "Where is he?" "He's at home, Mr. Harlow, but he's resting. I could—" "Tomorrow morning," Edward said. 9 o'clock. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. "I'll check whether he's well enough to receive a visitor at that hour," Diane said, with a professional calm that was neither deference nor resistance. "I'll call back before end of day." She called back at 5 in the afternoon to confirm. Edward went alone. No attorney, no assistant, no security. He took his own car, Not the Mercedes, but the gray Range Rover he used when he didn't want to be immediately identified, and drove to Pilsen in the cold Thursday morning. The address was a street of two-story brick houses, with bare trees lined along the sidewalk like exhausted soldiers. The rooming house was a two-story building painted ochre yellow, with a wooden front porch and a small bare garden. The sign on the door read, "Rivers Boarding House," in faded blue letters. Thomas Reed lived on the second floor, room number 4. Edward climbed the wooden staircase that creaked on 2 specific steps. He knocked. He waited. The door was opened by a man Edward immediately recognized as the man from the hotel entrance. Up close, Thomas Reed's face was a map of a life that had been hard without ever having become bitter. The skin was loose at the cheeks, his hair white and thin, his eyes light brown with a clarity that seemed incompatible with the fragility of the rest of him. He wore a brown wool sweater over a flannel plaid shirt, sweatpants and slippers. He smelled of menthol and old coffee. Thomas looked at Edward for a long moment without saying anything. Then he stepped back from the door. "Come in," he said. His voice was steadier than his body suggested. "I knew you would come." The room was small and very tidy. A single bed with an ironed blue cover. A dark wooden dresser with 4 drawers, on top of which sat a water bottle, a pill bottle, and a framed photograph. A wooden chair by the window. A small desk with papers organized in precise stacks. An electric kettle on a tray in the corner. The smell of a space inhabited with care by someone who did not have much but tended to what they had. Edward entered. He remained standing because he had not been invited to sit, and because sitting felt in that moment like a vulnerability he was not yet ready for. "You worked at a registry," Edward said, "in Detroit." 23 years, Thomas said. He sat on the edge of the bed with a care that revealed where the pain was, his left hip by the look of it. Birth records, deaths, adoptions. That was my job. "And how do you have a birth certificate with my name on it?" Thomas looked at his own hands for a moment. A working man's hands, with thick knuckles and visible veins. Then he looked at Edward with that quiet clarity that Edward was beginning to understand was not indifference. It was the opposite of indifference. It was the clarity of someone who had decided long ago what needed to be said and had spent years waiting for the opportunity. "Because I knew you're Rachel," Thomas said. "Rachel Ann Reed." Edward said nothing. "She wasn't my biological daughter," Thomas continued. "She was the daughter of my cousin Clara, who died of cancer when Rachel was 12. My wife and I raised Rachel after that, like she was our own. She called us aunt and uncle, but she was a daughter in every way that mattered." Edward felt something shift inside his chest, not violently, like a stone passing from one shelf to another, silently, altering the balance of everything around it. "She got pregnant in 1992, Thomas said. "With you. She knew it was yours because there was nobody else. She loved you, you know. It was the kind of love an 18-year-old has when she still believes everything can last forever." "Why did she leave?" Edward asked. The voice came out lower than he intended. Thomas took a deep breath. "Because your mother came to our house," he said. "Gloria Harlow, a woman with sharp words and money in her wallet, who showed up without warning on a Thursday afternoon and spent 2 hours convincing Rachel that you weren't ready to be a father, that a child would destroy your future, that it was better for everyone if she disappeared." Thomas paused. "And she paid. She paid $5,000 in cash for Rachel to go away and not tell you she was pregnant." The silence that settled in the room was different from other silences. It had physical weight, like wet sand. $5,000, Edward repeated. $5,000 in 1992, Thomas said, which for an 18-year-old girl with no family and no money was more than she had seen in her entire life. "And she accepted." Thomas looked at him with an expression that held no judgment. "She was 18 years old and pregnant and scared, and the mother of the man she loved was telling her he didn't want her," Thomas said. "She accepted because she believed it was the right thing to do. Because your mother convinced her it was. Because your mother convinced her that this was how it was." He paused. "Rachel spent the rest of her life believing that you knew about the pregnancy and had done nothing." Edward turned his face toward the window. Outside, the street was quiet. A woman walked with a small dog. A child waited for the school bus with a backpack on. The baby, Edward said. The certificate says adoption. Rachel went to rural Michigan, Thomas said. She had the baby in April of '93 in a small hospital. Lucas. She named him Lucas. He paused briefly. She gave him up for adoption 2 days later because she had no means to raise him. She came back to Detroit. She worked, tried to rebuild her life. Thomas paused again, this time longer. 2 years after the birth, Rachel got sick. An infection that started simple and wasn't treated in time because she had no health insurance and kept putting it off. She died in June of '95. He looked at Edward. She was 21 years old. Edward went still, 21 years old. Rachel had died at 21. While he was in Chicago signing his first real contract, celebrating with partners who weren't even friends, laying the first brick of what would become an empire, Rachel had died alone, at 21, carrying a secret that had destroyed them both without either of them knowing it. Edward put his hands in his coat pockets and stared at the window for a time he could not measure. "And Lucas," he said at last. "Where is Lucas?" Thomas got up from the bed with that painful care and went to the desk. He opened the top drawer and removed a thick brown envelope, which he placed on the desk without handing it over, just left it there, available. "Everything I managed to find is in that envelope," Thomas said. "I worked 23 years in a registry. I know how the system works. When Rachel died, I swore I would find Lucas one day and find his father too. It took years. Lucas was adopted by a family in Atlanta called Mercer. Craig and Diane Mercer. Good people. I thank God for that. Lucas grew up with them, uses their last name in daily life, but the original birth certificate has the Harlow name." Thomas looked at Edward with that clarity. "He's 30 years old. He works as an industrial maintenance technician. He lives in Atlanta. He doesn't know who his father is." Edward picked up the envelope. It was heavier than it looked. Inside were documents, the original birth certificate, an adoption certificate, tracking papers that Thomas had accumulated over the years with the meticulousness of someone who has a purpose that permits no carelessness. There was also a photograph. Edward took out the photograph. It was printed on plain paper, taken from a distance, with the quality of an old cell phone camera. It showed a young man from behind, in a dark blue work uniform, adjusting something on a large machine in a factory. Dark hair, broad shoulders, a posture. Edward felt the air leave his lungs more slowly than it should. A posture he recognized before he could name the recognition. The way the man held his head slightly tilted to the left while he worked. Exactly like that. Exactly the way Edward did it. "You came to the hotel," Edward said. His voice was dry. "3 days ago. You came to deliver this to me in person." "I tried," Thomas said, without accusation. "I was sent away before I could speak with you. So I called Diane." There was something Edward needed to say and wasn't finding the words for. He wasn't obligated to say anything. He could take the envelope, take the car, and process all of this in the efficient solitude he had cultivated for decades. That was what the Edward of any other day would have done. Instead, he stood in the center of that carefully arranged room, with the photograph of his son in his hand, and felt the bubble he had spent decades building do what bubbles do when they grow too large. Burst. "How much time do you have?" Edward asked. Thomas understood the question in the right sense. "The doctor said until summer," he said. "If I cooperate with treatment. I've been cooperating." "You're going to have the best treatment available," Edward said. "That's not negotiable." Thomas looked at him for a moment with an expression that wasn't quite gratitude. It was something closer to relief. The relief of someone who has spent decades carrying a promise and is finally watching the promise be kept. "I didn't do this for the treatment," Thomas said. "I did it because I promised Rachel before she passed that one day I would find the boy and tell the father he existed. That's all." Edward folded the photograph carefully, placed it back in the envelope, and tucked the envelope inside his coat, against his chest. The drive back to the hotel was the longest Edward had made in decades, not in miles, but in weight. He drove slowly through the Pilsen neighborhood, through the brick streets and graffiti and corner grocery stores, and let reality settle inside him in layers, one at a time, because all at once would not have been possible to bear. Rachel had loved him, had gotten pregnant, had gone away not because she wanted to, but because his mother had paid her to go. Gloria Harlow had purchased the disappearance of a pregnant girl for $5,000 and had buried the secret for nearly 30 years, and Rachel had died without ever knowing that Edward had never known anything. There was a son, a 30-year-old man named Lucas, who had grown up with another last name in a different city, not knowing who his father was. And there was Gloria Harlow, 71 years old, living in the same Detroit house where Edward had grown up, calling her son every Sunday at 11 in the morning to ask if he had eaten properly and was sleeping enough, and carrying this secret in some isolated compartment of her heart for nearly 30 years. Edward picked up his phone and dialed his mother's number. Gloria answered on the third ring with the voice of someone doing something else at the same time. "Edward, how nice. I was thinking of you this morning. I need to talk to you," Edward said. "Friday, I'm coming to Detroit." There was a small pause. "Is everything all right?" Gloria asked. And there was something in that tone, a faint tension, almost imperceptible, the fraction of a second of hesitation before the question, that Edward, for the first time, recognized. "I'll arrive at 6 in the evening," he said, and he hung up. Diane Foster had the habit of working until 8 at night, and it was at 7:40 that Edward appeared at her office without having scheduled anything. The receptionist had already gone home. Diane came to open the door herself, with an expression that evaluated the situation in less than 2 seconds and decided to let him in. "I need to find him," Edward said. "Lucas." "I know," Diane said. "I was expecting you to come." They sat for 2 hours. Diane had more information than she had placed in the envelope. Lucas's current address in Atlanta, his employer's name, a phone number that Thomas had obtained in a way she did not detail but which had clearly been careful and respectful. There was also additional documentation, records from the adoption registry of 1993, a handwritten letter from Thomas describing what he knew about Rachel and the pregnancy, and a notarized statement from Thomas about Gloria Harlow's visit to their home in 1992. This last one Edward read 3 times. The statement described the visit with precise details. The date, a Thursday in October of 92. What Gloria had worn, a dark green coat according to Thomas, who had opened the door. What she had said to Rachel in private, as Rachel had told Thomas afterward, crying in the kitchen. And the envelope with the money, which Thomas had seen with his own eyes because he had entered the room without meaning to, and found Gloria placing the dollars on the table while Rachel stood with her hands clasped together, trembling. "She'll deny everything," Edward said. "Probably," Diane agreed, with the professional serenity that Edward had come to understand was her trademark. "But that statement was notarized, and there's another witness." Edward looked up. "Thomas's wife, Eleanor Reed," Diane said. 82 years old, lives in Dearborn, Michigan. Fragile health but perfectly intact memory. She was also home that day. She also saw Gloria Harlow leave the house with the empty envelope in her hand. Edward folded the papers slowly and placed them in the folder Diane had prepared for him. "You'll need an experienced family attorney," Diane said, "not necessarily to sue anyone, but to guide the paternity recognition process and to protect your legal interests in the contact with Lucas. Can you do that?" Diane tilted her head slightly. "I can recommend someone better equipped for the paternity recognition," she said, "but I would be honored to continue as Thomas's representative in the process, and to assist you in whatever is needed if that gives you comfort." "Stay," Edward said. He got up to leave. He was at the door when he stopped and turned. "You knew all of this when you came to the hotel?" he asked. "I did," Diane said. "And if I had sent you away?" Diane looked at him with an expression that contained something close to humor, but only close. "I would have come back the next day," she said, "and the day after that. Thomas spent 29 years trying to reach you. 3 more visits weren't going to be a problem for me." Friday arrived with a different kind of cold. Not Chicago's cutting cold, but the heavy and familiar cold of Detroit in November, which Edward knew by heart and had never been able to associate with anything good or bad, only with the specific smell of home that sometimes appeared in dreams without warning. Gloria Harlow's house was the same as always. A two-story colonial in the Indian Village neighborhood, with a red tile roof and a huge beech tree in the yard, whose branches had grown so long they scratched the second-floor window on windy days. Gloria had renovated the kitchen 10 years ago and the master bathroom 5 years ago. But the rest of the house had the permanence of things no one touched, because they were part of the landscape of memory, and touching them would be like touching something sacred. Edward parked out front. He sat in the car for a moment with his hands still on the wheel, looking at the light on in the living room window. Inside the folder on the passenger seat was the birth certificate, Thomas's statement, and Eleanor Reed's statement, which Diane had obtained by email that morning, signed and scanned by Eleanor's granddaughter who cared for her. There was also a handwritten note that Thomas had included in the original envelope, which Edward had read only once but carried word for word in his memory. I owed this to Rachel. She loved her son until the end, even believing that he never knew she existed. Take good care of Lucas. Edward picked up the folder and went inside. Gloria was in the living room, in the red leather armchair she had bought right after Edward's father died, 23 years ago. She had the television on at low volume and a cup of tea on the armrest. She wore a wine-colored knit jacket over gray sweatpants and wool slippers. Her white hair was pinned back, as always. The pale pink lipstick was in place, as always. Gloria Harlow was the kind of woman who wore lipstick to walk to the kitchen for a glass of water. She stood when Edward entered with a smile that lasted perhaps less than a second before she saw her son's expression. Edward, what? Sit down, Mom, Edward said. His voice was calm. That was the most dangerous thing, and Gloria, who had known him for 52 years, understood immediately. She sat. Edward stood in the center of the living room. He opened the folder. He took out Lucas's birth certificate and placed it on the coffee table, facing Gloria. Gloria looked at the paper. She said nothing. Lucas Reed Harlow, Edward said. Born in April of '93. Mother, Rachel Ann Reed. Father, Edward James Harlow. Gloria did something with her hands that was not quite holding something and not quite letting go. It was a kind of involuntary contraction that happened and stopped and happened again. Edward, I'm not finished, he said, with that calm that was worse than any anger. He placed Thomas's statement beside the birth certificate. Thomas Reed, Rachel's adoptive uncle, states in a notarized document that in October of 1992, you went to their home and paid $5,000 in cash for Rachel to go away without telling me she was pregnant. Gloria opened her mouth. No, Edward said with absolute gentleness. Not now. He placed Eleanor Reed's statement on top of the other 2 pages. Eleanor Reed, Thomas's wife, 82 years old, saw you leave their house with the empty envelope in your hand. The silence in the room was different from all the silences Edward had spent his life accumulating. It was the silence of something that had been buried very deep for a very long time, and was now at the surface, exposed to air, with no way of being reburied. Gloria looked at the papers for a long time. When she spoke, her voice was that of someone who had been gathering strength for a long time, for an argument they had rehearsed and re-rehearsed, and who was now realizing, with the moment finally here, that the argument was no longer worth anything. I did it because I loved you, she said. You were 22 years old and had nothing yet. A pregnant girl would have destroyed everything you could become. You know what you would have done. You would have abandoned everything to stay with her and the baby. You were like that. You were, Mom. The word came out low, but cut through the air like a blade. Rachel died at 21. Gloria's mouth closed. 2 years after the birth, Edward said. She died because she had no money for a doctor, because she was alone, because you sent her away pregnant with $5,000, and she spent the last years of her life believing I knew she was pregnant and had chosen not to be there. He paused. She died thinking I didn't want her. Gloria's eyes filled with water. The tears were real. Edward could see they were real. And that changed nothing and changed everything at the same time, because Gloria's pain was real, and the damage she had caused was also real, and both things could exist simultaneously without one canceling the other. "I didn't know she was going to," Gloria began. "You didn't know, because you didn't want to know," Edward said. "You paid so you wouldn't have to know." Gloria closed her eyes. The smell of old tea and wood cleaner was in the air. The television continued at low volume, broadcasting a cooking show where someone smiled at the camera. The beech tree in the yard scratched the second-floor window in the wind. Edward gathered the papers, put them back in the folder, and stood for a moment looking at his mother with his head slightly tilted to the left side without noticing, exactly like the young man in the grainy photograph from Atlanta, adjusting a machine in a factory, completely unaware that the posture was printed in a DNA that ran through generations. "I'm going to find Lucas," Edward said. "I don't know how it will go. I don't know if he'll want to know me. But I'm going to try." He paused. "And when I find him, I'm going to be honest with him about everything that happened, including your role in it." Gloria opened her eyes. There was something there that was fear, and something that was shame, and something deeper still that was the recognition of an intelligent woman who had made a mistake that could not be undone, only, with enormous luck and enormous time, partially repaired. "Edward, not today, Mom," he said, without anger, without cruelty, with the clean exhaustion of someone who has reached the bottom of something and needs air. "Not today." He walked out without slamming the door. The Detroit cold received him outside with the impersonal familiarity of things that exist regardless of you. Edward returned to Chicago that night. He didn't sleep. He sat in the penthouse with the folder on the dining table and a glass of whiskey he had poured and not drunk, looking out at Lake Michigan, black and vast, beneath the starless sky, letting the pieces rearrange themselves inside him in silence. In the morning, at 7, he called Diane Foster. "I need to go to Atlanta," he said. "I know," Diane said. "Will you come with me?" A short pause. "Yes," she said. The trip to Atlanta was scheduled for the second week of December. Diane had prepared carefully. She had not made direct contact with Lucas, but had confirmed the address, the employer, the routine, and had also consulted a family reunification specialist who had given guidance on how the first contact could be made with as little additional trauma as possible for someone receiving this news without having sought it. "There is no perfect way to appear in someone's life and tell them you're their father," the specialist had said. "There's the honest way, and there's the way that feels like an ambush. Try the first, and accept that it will feel like the second anyway." Edward had written that on a sheet of paper and read it 3 times. Lucas's address was in the East Atlanta neighborhood, on a street of small, well-kept houses, with practical cars parked in the driveways and potted plants on the porches. It was a Monday evening. Edward and Diane arrived at 6:30. Edward stood outside the car for a moment with his hands in his pockets looking at the house. A simple brick house, red brick with a light on in the kitchen window and a dark blue pickup truck parked in the driveway. "Ready?" Diane asked. "No," Edward said, "but I'm going anyway." He knocked on the door. A time passed that seemed much longer than it was. Footsteps on the other side. The door was opened by a young man of 30, in jeans and a gray t-shirt, with a dish towel thrown over his shoulder as though he had just come from the kitchen. Dark hair, slightly disheveled. Brown eyes with an amber tone that Edward did not need much effort to recognize. They were his own eyes, seen from outside for the first time. The young man looked at Edward with a neutral, questioning expression. "Lucas Mercer?" Edward asked. "Yes," Lucas said. "My name is Edward Harlow." Edward paused. "You don't know me, but I believe I'm your biological father. And I came here because you deserve to hear that in person. From me. Before anything else." The silence that followed changed shape as it lasted. Lucas looked at Edward for a while, then looked at Diane, who was one step behind Edward with her professional posture but without the folder in hand. She had left the folder in the car deliberately. Then looked back at Edward. "Come in," Lucas said. His voice was lower than Edward had imagined. Calm, not the trained calm of executives, but the hard, real calm of someone who had learned to process surprises without explosion because life had given him reasons for that. Lucas's living room was simple and tidy. A brown leather couch, a television, a bookshelf with technical manuals and some science fiction novels. On the coffee table was a cup of coffee and an open equipment manual. It was the living room of someone who preferred clarity to decoration. Lucas sat on the edge of the couch. He did not offer anything to drink. "You said you believe," Lucas said. "Does that mean you have doubts or you have proof?" "I have proof," Edward said. "Original birth certificate with my name. Notarized statements from 2 witnesses who knew your biological mother and know what happened." He paused. "But the proof that matters is a DNA test, if you want to do one." Lucas stared at his own hands for a moment. "Why now?" Lucas asked. "I'm 30 years old." And then Edward told everything. Sitting in a simple wooden chair in front of Lucas Mercer's couch, in a living room in East Atlanta smelling of coffee and technical manuals, Edward told the story of Rachel Reed with the raw honesty of someone who had nothing left to hide and no reason to make it prettier. He told about the 11 months he had loved Rachel, about the disappearance he had read as rejection, about 30 years of silence, about Thomas Reed and the envelope and the birth certificate, about the visit to his own mother in Detroit. Lucas listened without interrupting. His face was quiet, not closed, but quiet. It was the face of someone processing information with great care before reacting. When Edward finished, Lucas sat in silence for a long moment. "My adoptive mother told me my biological mother had been a young woman without means to raise a child," Lucas said finally. "That it had been a difficult decision but made with love. They never said anything about the father. The adoption documents at the time probably had no information about the father," Edward said. "The original certificate with my name stayed in the records of the registry where Thomas worked." Lucas looked at Diane for the first time with real attention. "And you're Thomas Reed's attorney," Lucas said. "Yes," Diane said. "How is he?" "Sick," Diane said with direct honesty, "but at peace with what he was doing." Lucas got up. He went to the window and stood looking at the street for a moment, arms crossed, head tilted slightly to the left. And Edward felt his lungs tighten with a physical precision, like a hand closing around them slowly. "I need to think," Lucas said, without anger. With a coldness Edward immediately understood to be legitimate self-defense, and which he respected completely. "I'm not saying no. I'm saying I need time." "I understand," Edward said. "Do you have a number where I can call you?" Edward took a card from his pocket, not the hotel group card, but a simple card with just his name and personal cell number, and placed it on the coffee table. Lucas did not pick it up immediately. He just looked at it. "One thing," Lucas said. "You're not here out of guilt, are you? Or because a lawyer told you there was something that needed to be formalized?" Edward looked at him. "I'm here because you exist," Edward said, "and because I was the last to know that, and because the person who should have told me isn't here anymore for me to do this for her. I'm here because it's the only place that makes any sense to be." Lucas looked at him for a long moment. Then he picked up the card. In the 3 months that followed, contact between Edward and Lucas was slow and marked by the legitimate mistrust of someone who had built an entire life without a father and who did not need a father now. He needed, if he needed anything at all, an honest explanation and space to decide what to do with it. Edward called once a week. Sometimes Lucas answered. Sometimes he didn't answer and called back the next day. Once, 3 weeks after the first meeting, Lucas called unexpectedly on a Wednesday night and stayed on the phone for 40 minutes asking questions about Rachel. What Edward remembered, what she was like, what she liked, what made her laugh. Edward answered everything he knew, which was not much but was true. After one of those calls, Edward sat for a long time in his office, unable to do anything, because there was an emotion with no exact name, not joy, not grief, something that lived exactly in the middle, at the intersection of the two, like when it rains and the sun shines at the same time. The DNA test was done in the 2nd month. Lucas had asked in a short message, "I want to do the test, not because I doubt it, but because I need something solid." The results came back 2 weeks later with 99.996% paternal compatibility. Lucas was silent for an entire day after receiving the result. Then he sent a message. Okay, so that's it. And Edward had spent far more time looking at those 4 words than their length warranted, but they warranted it in weight. It was in February, 4 months after the first meeting in Atlanta, that the situation entered a crisis Edward had not anticipated. He had made a mistake. He had told the story to one person beyond Diane and Thomas. He had told his principal corporate attorney, Robert Sloan, a 55-year-old man he had worked with for 15 years and trusted with business matters, but had not stopped to evaluate whether he trusted with family matters. Robert had mentioned the situation, in general terms, to his partner in a conversation that was not supposed to be more than a portfolio update. Robert's partner was the brother-in-law of Garrett Whitmore, and Garrett Whitmore was the Harlow family's attorney. Specifically, he had been Gloria Harlow's attorney for over 2 decades. Edward found out about the leak on a Thursday morning when Diane called with a tenser voice than he had heard from her until then. Thomas received a call last night, Diane said, from an unidentified number. The person didn't identify themselves but knew specific details about the situation, including Lucas's address in Atlanta. The message was that Thomas should reconsider what he was doing before it became very costly for everyone involved. Edward stood in the center of his office. "That's a threat," he said. "Yes," Diane said. "Is Thomas all right?" "He is, but he's frightened. He's 67 years old, he's ill, and someone called the rooming house where he lives to make a veiled threat." Diane's voice was calm, but there was an edge there that wasn't typical of her. "I need you to know that this will not change anything on my part or Thomas's, but I thought you needed to know." Edward hung up and stood still for exactly 8 seconds. Then he picked up his phone and dialed Robert Sloan's number. Robert answered with the slightly hesitant voice of someone who had already received a warning that the call was coming. "Robert," Edward said, "I need you to tell me exactly what you said to your partner, exactly when you said it, and exactly who else might have heard." There was a pause that lasted far longer than it should have. "Edward, Exactly, Robert. Not an edited version," Robert told him. It had been a lunch, 3 weeks ago, with 3 people present. Robert, his partner Phil Donovan, and a mutual client named James Harker. Robert had mentioned, apparently as a general observation about the complexities of estate management in high-net-worth families, that one of his principal clients had recently discovered an unrecognized heir. He had given no name, but he had given enough for Phil, who knew Robert's portfolio, to make the connection. "Phil called Garrett Whitmore," Edward said, not as a question. "I don't know if—" "Don't lie to me, Robert." Another pause. "Yes," Robert said. "At least that's what I believe." Edward hung up. Garrett Whitmore was a 60-year-old attorney who had spent 2 decades being Gloria Harlow's legal protection and who understood very well what the recognition of Lucas as a Harlow heir could mean in terms of inheritance, group participation, and family reputation. Garrett was not a violent man. He was a man of legal instruments and indirect pressure who had learned over decades to resolve problems by making people understand that problems existed before direct confrontation became necessary. The threat to Thomas was the gentlest possible instrument. It was a message. "This can get ugly for more people than you think." Edward called Diane back. "I need you to document the threat," he said. "Origin number of the call, time, everything Thomas can remember of the exact words. I also need you to contact Lucas and update him on what's happening before he hears it from another source." "I already called Lucas," Diane said. "How did he react?" "With more calm than I expected," Diane said. "He said he wasn't surprised there was resistance and that it didn't change anything on his part." She paused. He said, "If a wealthy woman tried to buy my mother's silence 30 years ago, it makes sense that someone is trying to buy silence now. It didn't work the first time and it won't work now." Edward was silent for a moment. He said, "A wealthy woman?" Edward asked. "Yes," Diane said. "He knows it was your mother." Edward closed his eyes for a second. "Give me 2 days," he said. "I need to resolve this before it escalates." The following day, Edward drove to Detroit early in the morning and arrived at Gloria's house before 8. Gloria was still in her robe with her coffee in hand, and the expression when she saw her son at the door was not one of surprise. It was the expression of someone who had been awake waiting for that visit. "Garrett called Thomas Reed," Edward said, walking in before being invited. "Garrett has an obligation to protect my interests," Gloria said, with a firmness that was not comfortable but was rehearsed. "No," Edward said, with a calm that had ceased to be intimidating and had simply become true. "Garrett has no obligation whatsoever to threaten a sick 67-year-old man who is trying to keep a promise he made to a dead girl." The coffee cup in Gloria's hand was completely still. "You're going to call Garrett today," Edward said, "and you're going to tell him that if he makes contact with Thomas Reed, with Lucas Mercer, with Diane Foster, or with any other person involved in this situation, I will end every legal and financial arrangement that runs through his office, and I will separately hire an attorney to personally sue him for harassment of Thomas Reed." Gloria opened her mouth. "I'm not finished," Edward said. "You're also going to give me access to every document you kept about Rachel Reed. Signed contracts, receipts, anything you have. Because if you don't give them to me, Diane Foster will request them through legal channels, and it will be much worse." Gloria's face had a pallor that was not illness but confrontation. It was the pallor of someone who had spent decades building a narrative about their own motivations, and was watching that narrative be dismantled piece by piece, not with shouting but with facts. "I did what I believed was right," Gloria said. Her voice was lower now, less defensive and more exhausted. "I know," Edward said. "And you're going to have to live with what you did. I'm going to have to live with what I didn't do. With the years I know nothing about Lucas. With Rachel not knowing that I never knew. With everything that could have been different if you had given me the chance to choose." He paused. "But neither of us is going to live with this getting better if you keep acting as though the secret can be maintained." Gloria stood in the kitchen for a long moment without speaking. Then she went to the desk drawer in the hallway. Edward heard it open and close, and came back with a yellowed envelope, the kind used to keep important documents, with slightly crumpled edges from someone who had opened and closed it with care many times. She placed the envelope on the kitchen table. "It's in here," she said. "The receipt she signed. The agreement she signed saying she wouldn't contact you. A photograph of her that I had kept." Gloria's voice became something that was no longer defense and no longer attack. It was just an old voice carrying an old weight. "I knew her name. I knew where she lived. And when she died, I knew that too." She looked at the table. "I prayed for her, every week for years. I know it's worth nothing. But I did." Edward picked up the envelope. He said nothing for a moment. "Call Garrett by noon," he said. And he left. The final confrontation took place in a conference room at Diane Foster's office on a February afternoon with light rain tapping the window, with 3 people present besides Edward. Diane, the family attorney Diane had recommended named Michael Osei, and Garrett Whitmore, who had accepted the meeting with the professional serenity of someone who knew he was on ground that had become much more slippery than he had calculated. Garrett was a tall, well-dressed man with white hair combed to one side and a gray suit that cost more than Thomas Reed's monthly room rate. He had the bearing of someone who had been a good attorney for decades, and the posture of someone who had learned that most problems could be solved in the corridor before the courtroom. He had arrived expecting to negotiate. Edward had arrived with Gloria's envelope, Thomas and Eleanor's statements, the birth certificate, and the DNA result. Michael Osei, who was 42 years old, with closely cropped hair and the verbal precision of someone who had spent 15 years in family court, laid everything on the table with the order of someone who had rehearsed the presentation. "Voluntary paternity recognition," Michael said, placing a form in front of Garrett. "Mr. Harlow is requesting that all legal documents related to the birth of Lucas Reed Harlow in April of '93 be properly filed, with formal recognition of paternity and the updating of relevant records." Garrett looked at the documents. His expression was that of someone assessing the damage before calculating the cost of containment. "My client has legitimate concerns about the patrimonial implications," Garrett began. "Your client," Edward said, threatened a sick 67-year-old man who was trying to keep a promise to a dead woman. That was recorded, it's documented, and it's in the hands of a separate attorney who will take it to court if I ask." Garrett went silent. "Furthermore," Edward continued, with the calm he had learned to use as a precise instrument, "my mother gave me access to the documents she kept, including the receipt signed by Rachel Reed in October of '92. That document proves she paid for the mother of my son to go away. That is not a matter of inheritance. That is a matter of fraud and obstruction that, if I choose, has legal consequences extending far beyond any patrimonial question." Garrett looked at Michael. Michael returned the gaze with the serene expression of someone who knows exactly what they are holding. "Mr. Harlow is not interested in litigation," Michael said. "He is interested in formalizing his son's situation in a way that causes no more harm than has already been caused. What is being requested is simple: formal recognition, no interference from third parties in the process of establishing a relationship between father and son, and the immediate cessation of any pressure on Thomas Reed, Lucas Mercer, or any other party involved." Garrett turned his pen in his hand for a moment. "The patrimonial implications will need to be discussed at some point," he said. "They will be," Edward said. "By Michael, by me, and by Lucas, when Lucas is ready to have that conversation, which will not be today, will not be with you present, and will not be under any kind of pressure." He paused. "What is going to happen today is that you will sign as a witness to this recognition, and you will call Gloria confirming that the situation is closed." Garrett looked at Edward for a long moment. Then he picked up the pen. "All right," he said. Without genuine remorse in his tone, only the practical acknowledgement of someone who had calculated and recalculated and arrived at the conclusion that the ground had become untenable. "All right." The pen touched the paper. Lucas learned of the formal recognition through a message from Michael Ossie with a copy of the documents in PDF. He replied with 3 words: "Received, thank you. Okay." Edward stared at those 3 words for a while. Then he typed, "Can I call you this week?" Lucas replied after a day, "Yes." The call happened on a Thursday night. Lucas had come home from work, and there was something in the timbre of his voice that Edward had begun to learn to identify, a lightness that appeared when Lucas was less on guard, when he was just being, without needing to decide what he was. "That woman who called," Lucas said at one point. The woman Garrett had sent to make the veiled threat to Thomas. It hadn't been Garrett himself, but an assistant. "She knew my address." "Yes," Edward said. "I know. I'm sorry for that." "You're not the one who needs to apologize for that," Lucas said. "I should have protected the information better from the start." Lucas was quiet for a moment. "You know what I did when I found out there had been a threat?" Lucas said. "What?" "I called my adoptive parents," Lucas said. "Craig and Diane. Alive and well, at home in Atlanta. They picked up on the first ring." A brief pause. "I needed to remember that there were concrete people in the world. Not history, not documents, not DNA. Concrete people who know me." "That makes sense," Edward said. "They know I've been in contact with you," Lucas said. "My adoptive mother cried a little, not for me. She said it was for Rachel. For a girl she never met, but who she knew had loved her son before he existed." Edward was silent for a moment. "I'd like to meet them someday," he said. Lucas was quiet for a time. "Someday," he said. In March, Thomas Reed entered palliative care. Edward had kept his promise, the best treatment available, but the doctors had been clear from the start. Treatment could extend time with quality of life, not reverse the process. Thomas had accepted that with the same serenity with which he had accepted everything else, with the peace specific to someone who had done what needed to be done and was in order with the world. Edward visited him twice at the hospital. The first visit was awkward. There was between them Edward's gratitude and Thomas's relief, and no common language to connect the two, because the common language they might have had was Rachel, and speaking of Rachel was difficult for both of them in different ways. In the second visit, in the last week of March, Thomas was weaker, but more at peace. "Has Lucas gone to see you?" Thomas asked. "Not in person yet," Edward said. "But we're in contact. It will happen when he's ready. Thomas nodded faintly. He's like her, Thomas said. Not in looks, in the way he thinks. Careful, doesn't open up to just anyone. But when he does, he opens completely. Edward looked at his own hands. You knew what he was like, Edward said. You followed him from a distance. I did what I could, Thomas said. I never got close. I thought it wasn't my place. It was the Father's place. He looked at Edward. Now it's your place. Thomas died in April in the second week of the month, one day after Lucas's 31st birthday. Lucas heard of Thomas's death from Edward himself, who called as soon as Diane informed him. Lucas was silent for a moment after receiving the news. He kept his promise, Lucas said. He did, Edward said. I want to go to the funeral, Lucas said, if that's possible. It will be possible, Edward said. I'll take care of it. Thomas Reed's funeral was small and simple, in a funeral home in Chicago, where Thomas had asked to be laid out because Chicago was the city where he had finally managed to deliver what he had promised. There was Diane Foster, 3 neighbors from the rooming house, the nurse who had cared for him in his final months, and Eleanor Reed, his 82-year-old wife who had traveled from Dearborn for the occasion and who spent most of the time sitting with her purse in her lap and her eyes closed, praying silently with her lips faintly moving. And there was Edward, and there was Lucas. It was the first time they had been in the same space since the meeting in Atlanta 4 months earlier. There was not much protocol for that kind of situation. Lucas arrived by car from Atlanta, walked into the room, saw Edward, and the 2 men stood facing each other with Thomas's casket behind them and the scent of white lilies in the air. Lucas extended his hand. Edward took the hand and held it. That was it. For now, that was it. And it was enough. After the funeral, when the others had gone and only Edward and Lucas remained in the empty room with the low light and the specific silence of places where grief is still fresh in the air, Lucas stood looking at Thomas's casket for a while. Did you know him well? Lucas asked. I only went to see him twice, Edward said, but he was the kind of man who leaves a mark in little time. Lucas nodded faintly. He must have been a good father, Lucas said. Edward was quiet. Did you have a good father? Edward asked. Yes, Lucas said without hesitation. Craig Mercer is a very good man. A brief pause. I'm not saying that to hurt you. I'm saying it because it's true, and because I think you need to know that I grew up well. I need to know that, Edward said. Thank you for telling me. Lucas looked at him sideways. You're different from what I expected, Lucas said. What did you expect? Someone who shows up with money and tries to buy back the lost time, Lucas said. Someone who tries to fix 30 years in 2 conversations. I can't fix 30 years in 2 conversations, Edward said. I know, Lucas said. That's why you're different. They went to dinner at a simple restaurant near the funeral home, a place with wooden tables and a menu on a chalkboard, where the pasta was good and the wine came in an unlabeled bottle but was honest. They spent 2.5 hours at the table. Lucas ordered the pasta with red sauce and ate with the direct appetite of someone who works with their hands and has no ceremony around food. Edward ordered the same. They talked about Lucas's work, industrial maintenance, heavy equipment, the specific satisfaction of understanding how a machine works and fixing what's wrong with it. Lucas spoke about it with a contentment that Edward recognized immediately because it was the same contentment he had felt decades ago when he had built the first thing that was truly his. You love what you do, Edward said. Very much, Lucas said. It's not glamorous, but it's concrete. Either it works or it doesn't. No room for nonsense. Edward thought for a second before speaking. There's a maintenance team in the hotel group, he said with care. Good people. 23 properties in 12 cities. I'm not offering anything, just saying it exists in case you ever want to know more. Lucas looked at him. Are you trying to give me a job? I'm saying an opportunity exists, Edward said. What you do with that information is entirely yours. Lucas was silent for a moment. Send me the details, he said. I'll look at it. It was the first time Lucas had asked for something. Small, practical, without excessive symbolic weight. But the first time. Edward felt something with no exact name, but that was close to gratitude, and to relief, and to a beginning so careful it could barely be seen, but was there. 6 months later, Lucas had accepted a position as maintenance coordinator at the Harlow Grand in Chicago. Not by favoritism, he had insisted with Michael Osei before accepting, but because he had gone through a standard selection process with the operations director and had been the most technically qualified choice among 4 candidates. The operations director, who initially did not know of the relationship between Lucas and Edward, had sent Edward a short, enthusiastic email about the new coordinator. "This Lucas Mercer is excellent. He finds the problem before it becomes a problem." Edward had read that with something in his chest that was perhaps pride and was certainly new. Lucas had moved to Chicago in August. He lived in an apartment in the Logan Square neighborhood, 15 minutes from the hotel by bus or bicycle, depending on the weather. He had furnished the living room himself with pieces from a second-hand store and a new lightwood bookshelf he had bought and assembled in a weekend. On the shelf were the technical books and the science fiction novels, and in a corner on the third shelf, a black-and-white photograph that Edward had had printed and framed. The only photograph that existed of Rachel Reed, taken by Thomas decades earlier, showing an 18-year-old girl sitting on a porch with a book in her lap, laughing at something outside the frame, with her eyes half closed in the sun. Lucas had placed the photograph on the shelf without saying anything about it to Edward, but Edward had seen it on a visit to the apartment and had said nothing either. Some things do not need words. In the office on the 18th floor of the Harlow Grand, there was, since September, a wooden chair in the corner by the window that was always available. Everyone on the floor knew it was Lucas's chair. Not because Edward had said so, because every other Friday Lucas came up after his shift, knocked twice, walked in, and the 2 of them sat in silence for a moment before one of them began to talk. Sometimes it was about work, sometimes about Detroit. Lucas had gone to Detroit once, wanting to understand where he had come from, had stayed 2 days and come back with questions that took weeks to answer. Sometimes it was about Rachel, whom Edward was coming to know in pieces through Thomas's and Eleanor's memories and his own imagination, reconstructing the person he had loved with $17 in his pocket and enough pride for a lifetime. One Friday in October, with rain beating on the office window and Chicago below them small and lit, Lucas was quiet after a long stretch of conversation and looked at Edward with an expression Edward had not yet seen in him. Not defense, not assessment, not the careful neutrality that had been his default posture in the early months. It was something simpler than any of those things. "Are you going to stay in Chicago?" Lucas asked. "This has been my base for 30 years, Edward said. Lucas nodded faintly. "Good," he said. Edward looked at his son's profile against the lit window, the broad shoulders, the head slightly tilted to the left, the expression of someone who was in the place he needed to be in that moment, and felt the inside of the bubble he had spent decades building with such care do something it had never done before. Breathe. There was a question Lucas had asked on one of his visits to the office, on a Thursday at the end of September, with coffee between his hands and rain outside, that Edward had taken weeks to answer completely. The question had been simple. "If you had known back then," Lucas had said, "if you had known she was pregnant, what would you have done?" Edward had been quiet for a time far too long to pretend it was just thought. "I was a 22-year-old fool who didn't yet know what I'd know at 30, Edward had said finally. "I won't promise you I would have done everything right because I don't know that. But I know I would never have sent her away." He paused. "I know you would have existed, with your father present, and I wouldn't have spent 30 years not knowing you were in the world." Lucas had been quiet for a moment. "Okay," he had said, not as approval, as acceptance, as someone who had heard the truth and recognized it for what it was. And then he had finished his coffee and gone down to his shift. The last conversation with Gloria happened in November. Edward went to Detroit on a Sunday, and they had lunch in the kitchen of the house, with food Gloria had made, pasta with meat sauce, the way she had made it since Edward was 12. And they talked differently than they had talked before. Not easily, but differently. Gloria had called Garrett and done what Edward had asked. had handed over the documents, had spent the months that followed in a silence that was not the silence of someone hiding, but of someone processing. It was the silence of a 71-year-old woman who had spent 3 decades convinced she had done what was necessary and who was, at great cost and over time, arriving at the understanding that the conviction had been armor and the armor had done damage. "I want to meet him," Gloria said at the end of lunch with the coffee cup between her palms. "If he ever wants to." "I'll tell him," Edward said. "I don't know what I'd say," Gloria said. "There's no way to undo it." "There's no way to undo it," Edward agreed. "But there is a way to continue differently." Gloria was silent for a moment. "Rachel was a good girl," she said, softly, with the voice of someone saying something for the first time that they had thought many other times. "I knew that. I knew it, and I did what I did anyway." Edward said nothing. "I pray for her," Gloria said. "She knew," Edward said. Not because there was any way to know, but because it was what needed to be said, and because there was a kindness in saying it that was not a lie. Only a form of mercy he was learning to have. Gloria closed her eyes for a moment, then she got up to get more coffee for both of them. In December, the day before Christmas, Lucas appeared at Edward's office outside his usual hours. On a Saturday morning, when the floor was nearly empty, with snow falling outside in large, lazy flakes that made the lake invisible. He came in with 2 brief knocks, as always. He was carrying something in his hands. It was a drawing, made on printer paper with colored pens, clearly drawn by a small child. There was a house, a sun, 2 large figures and a smaller one, trees, and in the upper corner, in the handwriting of someone learning to write, the words, "Mercer Harlow family." "My cousin," Lucas said, without any further explanation. "My adoptive sister's daughter, 5 years old. She overheard the adults talking and made this." Edward looked at the drawing for a while. The 2 large figures had hair drawn with care. One had dark spiky hair, the other had white hair on the sides and less on top. A reasonably accurate representation of Edward actually, considering the artist was 5. "Mercer Harlow family," Edward read aloud. "Her teacher told her to write the family name," Lucas said. "She said she had 2 family names and needed to put both." Edward placed the drawing on the desk, carefully, with both hands. The way you place something fragile, somewhere safe. He looked at it for a while. Lucas stood in the same position he had stood in on many other visits, with the hard, real calm that was the mark of his way in the world. Then he said, in that lower tone that Edward had learned to recognize as the tone of things that truly mattered, "Will you be here for New Year's?" "I'll be here," Edward said. "I might stop by," Lucas said. "The chair will be here," Edward said. Lucas nodded faintly. He turned to leave. At the door he stopped for a second, didn't turn all the way, just stayed in profile, hand on the handle, and said, "Merry Christmas, Edward." It was the first time he had used the name. Edward stood in the center of the office with snow falling outside, and a child's drawing on the table, and an empty chair in the corner, and the specific silence of a man who is learning, at 52, that the opposite of being alone is not being surrounded by many people. It is being with the right person, in the right place, in the moment when you have finally stopped running from your own name. Some stories take 30 years to begin. That does not mean they began too late. It means they took exactly the time they needed, so that both sides arrived ready. The lesson this story carries is not about money, not about inheritance, not about what is lost when someone does wrong while believing they are doing right. The lesson is simpler and more difficult than any of those things. Secrets kept out of love are no less destructive than secrets kept out of malice. The truth, however late it arrives, still arrives. And when it does, the only thing that can be done is to stand before it and choose, with whatever time remains, what to do next. Edward Harlow had built an empire of glass and steel with his own hands, but the only brick he had laid that truly mattered was that wooden chair in the corner of his office, always available, always waiting. And every other Friday, Lucas Mercer Harlow came up. I hope you enjoyed watching it as much as I enjoyed creating it. Like, share, and comment on the lessons you've learned.